Okay, everybody, walking us through the last part of our naturalistic inquiry chapter, ethnographic methods, where basically we are interested in studying groups in their actual environment to see how these individuals kind of function as members of this group. And basically, you look to see how they establish meaning, create meaning within this group through their communication. And you do this primarily through observation and through interviews. And so I listed a couple of my favorite ethnographies here on the slide. So the first one I think we talked about really early in the class called the fragile community, where you had two researchers, Adelman and Fry, kind of be the fly on the wall in these houses this house called the Bonaventure House, which in the late 80s, early 90s housed people who had lost their jobs and their families and their homes because of discrimination following HIV/AIDS diagnosis. And so they looked to see how this group kind of came together and helped each other through the dying process and create meaning as this fragile community following their HIV/AIDS diagnosis at a time when kind of everybody else was shunning them. So they were really interested in how they use communication to establish meaning in that group. Nickel and Dimed is a book I read as an undergrad at University of Dayton that I really liked. And this was Barbara Ehrenreich, who she's a journalist and kind of a different sociology writer. She basically did a different type of ethnography where she put herself at the center and basically picked three different jobs that paid minimum wage to see how difficult it is in America to work a job, even if you're working 40 plus hours a week, to have whether that minimum wage is actually a living wage, how if she was able to get by with those three jobs. And so we'll talk about kind of the differences between those two different ethnographic methods. In the bottom right, one of my professors from University of Kentucky, Alan DeSantis, did an ethnography of Greek life of a fraternity at a different couple of different universities across the United States. And so that is another example of an ethnography where basically, again, we're just trying to capture people's explanations of their language and their behavior and their actual behavior and their language. And so it can kind of provide a check on what people say they do and what they actually do. And so the different types, the first one is complete observer, where, so for example, in the upper right corner, I have a picture of a bunch of live action role players or LARPers. And so let's say that you're really interested in LARPing as kind of building a community, and you're interested in how this group uses communication to kind of create an identity or create meaning together. And so if you were a complete observer in this case, you would have no interaction with any of the people who are LARPing. You would basically just go to the park where they're having their kind of live action role playing session, maybe sit on a bench, and you're observing them and they don't really realize that you're observing them. So some of the benefits of this obviously would be you get to maintain distance, actually get to study people in their actual environment. But one of the downsides is you don't get to learn much more than what you see. So if you have specific questions, you don't get to ask them. You don't get to kind of go in depth a lot. So if you're really interested in that naturalism, but you're willing to sacrifice that depth, then complete observer also raises some ethical questions because you're just kind of, I don't know, eavesdropping on everybody and writing them into your report. So how that would reflect IRB and other ethical considerations would probably remain to be seen. But okay, next one is observer as participant, where if you were to go to maybe one of those LARPing events and they would know that you're a researcher, you basically just go to one and you have to decide what you're going to observe and what questions you're going to ask now that you're interacting with these people. So it's a really low level of involvement with a lot of people in a short amount of time. And so you could really run the risk of inadequate understanding or of maybe misunderstanding the answers to the people give you or what you're observing. So the ones that are typically used more, the ones that the Mirth group talked about today in class, that's a lot more valid and a lot more widely accepted in ethnography research is participant and as observer, where you're studying a community for a longer period of time. You're going to be there. They know that you're a researcher. They know that you're studying them. And eventually they kind of forget that you're there studying them. So people, after the initial shock wears off, the idea is that people will kind of get back to their lives and act naturally. So the goal here is to kind of over that time build mutual trust. And like I said, it might be problematic because after time you might be reluctant to maybe ask or answer questions that could hurt what's essentially a growing relationship or growing friendship. So the more you kind of become accepted by this group and brought in, you could be more and more biased and wanting to protect them more and maybe looking past some of the negatives of this group. So you go native, which is a term that people use when people kind of fall in with a group and forget their original purpose and forget their objectivity. And so, for example, the fragile community one is participant as observer. The Alan DeSantis one in the bottom right corner is participant as observer. There was another study where Alan sat in with a cigar shop, a group of people at a cigar shop that he frequented normally, and he basically looked to see how they rationalized their cigar smoking when someone would bring up the fact that, like, cigars are not good for you. He would look to see how they kind of characterized or how they would kind of throw that off and say, well, it's not as bad as cigarette smoking, or all these doctors don't know what they're talking about, or I don't inhale, right? So he looked to see how they rationalized, but he sat in with these groups and kind of listened to them talk. They accepted him as already as part of that community. They knew he was doing a study on them and that kind of thing. And so but yeah, another study that I really like followed. It was a PhD student at University of South Florida, where she basically followed around her boyfriend for 48 hours during one of his medical resident shifts. He was in his first year of his residency in medical school, and or following medical school, and she followed him as he was on one of his 48-hour shifts back in the late 90s. They don't really do that anymore, but just kind of seeing how easy it is for doctors to lose empathy for their patients in the emergency room and stuff. And so she was basically a fly on the wall. Everyone knew she was there, but she was there to also interview people and that kind of thing. So there for a long time to kind of build the trust and build these relationships. And then finally, complete participant is essentially when someone goes undercover. You are basically being a mole, or you're being Mrs. Doubtfire, if you remember that movie, or the original Fast and the Furious, where somebody kind of goes undercover. And the researcher's role is basically unknown to the community. You're kind of masquerading. You're pretending to be someone other than who you are. So you take on this different identity. You don't tell people you're a researcher. Nickel and Dimed did this, where she took these 3 jobs, didn't tell anybody she was working at Walmart, but she didn't tell anybody she was doing it for research or to write a book, right? She just wanted a job at Walmart. So the problem is you might become so involved in your participant role that you can't really function well as an observer. You might be so kind of busy doing what you're supposed to be doing in this community that you've, again, lose objectivity and you forget the fact that you're supposed to be reporting on them. You could also be betraying participants' trust at the end by saying, hey, guess what? It wasn't really this person who you thought I was. I'm a researcher. I'm writing all about you. And so that would definitely be a type of deception that you have to debrief at the end of the study. Okay, so people probably pretty pissed depending on the situation. All right, and then a couple things to keep in mind when you are doing ethnography. You have to identify a gatekeeper. A gatekeeper is someone who can allow you initial access to this community. Okay, whether it's I'm preparing possibly an ethnography in the Children's Hospital at University of Michigan, and my gatekeeper was someone I met through a program at U of M last May, and he invited me to come just kind of shadow him or observe him. And so just over time getting to know him, he is going to provide more and more access to this environment, to more people on the emergency room floor, more areas in the emergency room. And so he provided access as a gatekeeper. Key informants are people in this community who are very important to talk to. They're people who hold a lot of power, people who have a lot of emphasis on making the meaning in the community. And so they're people who you would definitely want to talk to, people who hold a lot of sway. And so whether or not the gatekeeper or the key informant knows that you're a researcher or not, that depends. But the participant as observer, this one here, is probably the most widely used ethnography format and communication. Okay, so some of the principles here. And so again, if you have 4 minutes after this video, click on this link here, and it'll take you to a really good kind of video description, really quick, of what an ethnography does and what it looks like. So basically, what you do is, as a researcher, you're immersing yourself in a particular culture and a culture's natural settings. So you want to get as close to as possible as how these people normally live, how these people normally communicate, so you can get as close to the actual meaning that they experience on a day-to-day basis. Again, you're paying attention to what they tell you and what they're actually doing. So that's why you're combining interviews with direct observation, because you're paying attention to what they say, you're paying attention to what they do, you're seeing if these two things possibly contrast with one another. Maybe you're asking them questions about the things that they do, so you can learn more about the why. Right? And so the goal here, not to generalize, you're focused on the very local, kind of very subjective knowledge and categories that groups create through communication. Just because I study this one emergency room does not mean it's true of all pediatric emergency rooms in the United States. I am just focused on this one emergency room. Okay, and again, you have to engage directly unless you're doing complete observer, okay, where they don't know that you're there. You are actually going to sit down and talk with them, even though you're observing them too. Just like we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, you have to be really good at writing. You have to be really good at being descriptive in your writing and painting a picture with your words. You have to be really creative. You have to be really good at asking questions, at interpreting what people are saying, at listening and observing. And so the writing portion of this is so important because you're bringing to life things that people have never really experienced on their own, right? The best ethnographies are ones that bring to light kind of groups that have not really had much say or don't get much attention in society. You're giving this group a voice. Okay, so I gave an example, if you click here, of a really good ethnography that someone who was a couple years older than me at University of Kentucky, she took an advanced ethnography class, and she basically put all of her study in the form of a website called Flowing Through the City. Her name's Renee Human, and she did an ethnography as a participant observer, okay, participant as observer, where she basically rode the bus every year because she was doing it anyway, right, to get to school. And so she decided to kind of observe people on the bus, talk to people on the bus, and it did get published in a journal. So if you want to scroll through this, it's really good. She talks a little bit about her rationale, why she did this study. It is structured like a research article, but it's done in a different format, which is kind of something I'm really interested in looking at now. What are some ways I can get my research out that is not necessarily in an article, so I can reach more people? So she talks about her rationale here, her theories. Okay, so how this kind of links to previous communication research leading up to her research questions, right? There's her second and her first. What are her methods? She talks exactly about what she did. That's what the bus looks like. She talks about the exact form of ethnography that she takes. And she's going to talk about how she's mixing pictures with interviews with, and then if you look here in her in her notes, she talks all about the different types of pictures she took and the notes she takes. These are called field notes, which we'll talk about here in a second. How she analyzed the data, which is coming up here in a second as well. What she found, why it matters, that kind of thing. All our references, and a quick kind of summary at the end, personal notes. Mostly of reflexology, talking about what her biases are, why she was drawn to this topic, that kind of thing. Okay, possibly thanking people, that kind of thing. All right, so check that out if you have a couple minutes. Definitely watch that video as well. But okay, so 3 different types of notes when you're doing an ethnography. The first one is descriptive notes, where you're basically this is just the raw data of your interactions with people in the setting that are the focus of the ethnography. So when you interview people, maybe your video recordings or your audio recordings and all of your notes that you write as you're sitting and observing and watching. So just kind of, these are descriptive notes where you're describing what is going on. Okay. Method notes is when you specify which method you're using to gather the data on a given day. So this is through direct observation. This is through a group interview. This is through video recording. This is through scrolling through people's social media. Yeah, you can do an ethnography online too, where you just basically look at people's Facebook pages, their Twitter pages. Maybe you interview them, combine them. Why did you say that? Why did you post this? That kind of thing. Okay, but method notes, again, you're just specifying the method that you used. And again, people are likely to behave and speak differently in one-on-one interviews than when they're in a group setting. And so You want to specify which is from where. And then finally, analytic notes, where you are starting to interpret those descriptive notes. You're maybe attributing some theories and explanations to some of the things you're seeing and hearing and asking about. And so these theories and these explanations are going to change as the study progresses and as you gather more and more data. Okay, so those are the 3 types of notes to know. All right, so if a researcher were to attend Gamblers Anonymous, they're going to collect data without letting the people know that he or she is a researcher, and then indicate to the group that he or she is studying them at the end. This is an example of what type of ethnography. So I'll give you a second to think about it. So it'd be like someone going to a Gamblers Anonymous meeting pretending that they are a gambler. They have a gambling addiction. So this would be complete participants, where you would not tell anybody until the very, very end that you were a researcher all along. You don't have a gambling problem. Again, it would be pretty tough to get through I or B. Okay, so technically, complete observer, the first type of ethnography we talked about, is not really an ethnography because ethnographies have to combine interviews with observation. So observational studies are when you maybe set up a recorder or an audio recorder, or you sit in the corner of maybe, let's say, a doctor's office and you're studying how a doctor talks to patients. Okay. If you're not combining those observations with interviews, then that is not an ethnography. It's called an observational study. Okay. Unobtrusive measures on the right is when you basically are setting up and they don't know that you're there. Okay. So kind of like that first one we talked about, where it's unobtrusive because you're spying on people and they don't know that you're there as a researcher. Okay, they don't know they're being watched. So, with our focus groups, with our interviews, with our ethnography, what do we do with all this data once we have it finished? Once we have feel like, okay, we're done doing interviews, we're done doing focus groups, we're done doing ethnographies, we've gotten all the data I think we need. What do we do with all this data? Well, usually you transcribe it. You take the audio recordings, you take the video recordings, you type out all the kind of dialogue, and you flatten it out on a page, right? So it takes away a lot of the context clues. It takes away a lot of the nonverbals in some cases, but you have all the language kind of on a sheet of paper. Again, it depends on what you're going for. If you're doing a article, typically that's what you'll do. You'll transcribe it. If you're doing a video project, maybe you'll keep some of that audio or video data and do something new with it. But basically, when you do a qualitative study, you got to start before you even collect data. Just starting with some basic questions, some basic purpose, some basic theory. It could be as broad as you want. It could be as specific as you want. It's very different than quantitative. Quantitative, it has to be very, very specific going in. Then you design the study. You figure out, am I doing an interview? Am I doing a focus group? Am I doing ethnography? Who is my sample? How am I going to select my participants? And then you actually collect the data. You transcribe the data. Then how do you analyze this data? Well, usually we try to, so let's pretend like we're going to put this into category and we're going to put this on a page, right? We're going to transcribe. We need to put some of these meanings into categories. Okay, so you start grouping things together. What are things that people are saying that hang together as being, a theme? And so the easiest way to explain this is like the same way we did our 3 themes for the last paper, where you guys had to talk about the 3 things that these articles had in common. We do basically the same things with interviews. Okay, so you can do 3 different types of data analysis just for the sake of ease for now. So the first one is called constant comparative method, also called grounded theory, where you don't go in with any set theory or set plans. You have completely open ideas for what your codes are going to be or your themes. So you just start reading and you say, this goes with this. This seems to hold together as one category. This one seems to hold together in a completely different category. So if I'm reading my interviews with young adult cancer survivors, I'm like, people really seem to be using humor to kind of be able to speak openly about their cancer. They're doing it to be able to say, I am not like this group. And they're also doing it to say, I'm really like this group. And so you keep building these categories and you keep specifying these categories and putting things into groups. But you have constant comparative methods when you start with no set idea in mind. Fixed coding, to go up to the top, is when you have a complete and total coding plan in place. I know I'm going to look for these 5 things. a lot of times this has to be the result of previous research, whether it's someone else's study or your own study that you did, maybe a quantitative study that you did, or sorry, another qualitative study that you did. You generate your themes and you're taking those themes and you're basically putting them on top of the interviews. You're saying, all right, as I read through these interviews, I'm going to see if these 5 things, I'm going to put in these 5 things in all the categories, right? So we did a study where we interviewed people who, parents, but parents who, people who were either about to have a baby or just had a baby, and we applied relational dialectics theory, which has 3 different kind of tensions or 3 themes to it, to their interviews. And so, for example, relational dialectics theory says that when we are in a relationship, we are either really connected or we are really individual. We're either really focused on things that are new and different, or we want to maintain normalcy, and we want to be open with other people or with ourselves, and we want to be really private about other things. And so we took these 3 themes or these 3 tensions and applied it to all the data. That's called fixed coding. You come in with a plan, you don't deviate from that plan. Flexible coding is kind of a in between fixed coding and constant comparative, where flexible coding is you come in with certain categories, but you are open to new things that emerge. Okay, so if you use flexible coding in your paper, you have to tell me what some of your what you plan to have as your initial themes. What are some things you want to go into your study with? Okay, but then you're sensitive to, all right, well maybe this theme doesn't work here, so I'm just going to scrap it. Or new things are coming up. I didn't think about this before, so I'm going to include it. All right, so a couple things. This is the last thing we're going to talk about with your data. Our reliability and validity is always a concern. It's not something we can just do a statistical test with, like in quantitative studies. So we determine whether or not something is, we don't really say reliable and valid with qualitative research. We say if it's confirmable, or if it's trustworthy, or if it just makes sense, if it kind of fits with the real world and it's consistent. So the one thing we do is called data saturation, where we basically do data analysis and we sample until we're not getting any new answers anymore. Like once you stop seeing new things, then you know you're finished, right? Your question has been answered. I'm not learning anything new. I've reached saturation. I've reached the end. It's too redundant. There's no point in me sampling anymore or analyzing anymore. That's what saturation is. That means you're in a good shape, right? Because you're not getting new answers. Another thing you can do is called triangulation, where you look at the same phenomenon from 3 different points of view. So for example, I could do that mirth floor study that we talked about earlier today through observation, combined with interviews, combined with survey results. And all of these 3 methods should generate the same ideas. Okay. So that's what triangulation means. It's just 3 sides of the same shape, basically. And one is not kind of contrasting with the other. Another thing you can do too at the end is once you write up your results, write up your findings, send your findings to people in the community you just got done talking to or observing. It's called a group member check, where they tell you if you're off base or if you're wrong, if you're interpreting this incorrectly, if you're missing something. And so that helps you to determine if you are actually capturing what you saw, what you heard in the community properly, and you're not misinterpreting something. Okay, so that's it for chapter 11. Let me know if you have any questions. Hopefully this helps for Wednesday. Talk to you later.